This section will instruct the builder to wrap the exhaust pipes with the heat wrap and install the exhaust pipes. Locate the following components. Reference the construction print E25-2000. Deburr and inspect the end of the exhaust pipes. File the triangle flanges flat before mounting the headers to the engine. Soak the heat wrap with water. Starting at the bottom, begin wrapping tightly, overlapping 1/2 inch. Use the 2 longer rolls to double wrap the longer exhaust pipes as shown. After reaching the top, go back down using the same technique. This will give a double wrap above the aluminum heat shield. Use removable wire ties to temporarily hold the wrap in place. This will also help remind you where to install the high temperature tie wraps. Wherever the pipes are next to each other, wrap them together as shown. Use the high-temperature tie wraps to clamp the heat wrap in place at each end. Use additional tie wraps where needed. Do not install the tie wraps too close to the flanges, as they might interfere with the bolts that secure the exhaust to the engine. Use the supplied high-temperature spray paint E24-9870 to coat the wrap to protect it from fluid spills such as fuel, oil, and water. Make sure to remove the tape and the plastic plugs. Attach the exhaust system to the engine as shown, using gaskets at the flanges. If necessary, use a quick grip clamp to position the exhaust pipe flange over the engine exhaust port to install the bolts. Torque the bolts to 10 foot-pounds in final assembly. Note, it is not necessary to safety wire the bolts. After the engine has had its first run up to operating temperatures, retorque the bolts to 10 foot-pounds and then check periodically. This shows the exhaust pipes installed on the engine. The muffler will be fitted later. This section will instruct the builder to install the radiator, fan shroud, inlet manifold, thermostat, and surge tank. The builder will also install the oil sump heat exchanger, oil hoses, and filter. Locate the following components. Reference the construction prints E30-2000 fan shroud and E37-2000 oil and cooling system. Also reference construction print E13-2000 engine mount. Note, remove the tail rotor drive pulley from the secondary shaft if installed. Slide the fan and fan pulley assembly without the upper snap ring onto the secondary shaft. Do not use Loctite at this time. Use the lower snap ring to hold assembly. Before installing the hoses, flush them thoroughly with solvent and blow them dry with compressed air. Carefully inspect the insides of the hoses for any dirt or debris. Apply a light film of engine oil to the threads and chamfers of the fittings. The steel braiding on the hoses is extremely abrasive. Position the hoses so that they do not contact or rub on anything else. If a hose must touch another component, cut a length of rubber hose, wrap it around the braided hose, and secure it with wire ties. Route the hoses so that they curve smoothly without being kinked or sharply bent. The aluminum hose ends and fittings can be damaged if over-tightened. To get the right amount of leverage, grip the wrench about 3 or 4 inches from the fitting. One of the biggest obstacles in keeping your aircraft's engine cool is heat recirculating in and behind the engine compartment. In forward flight, the air scoops supply plenty of outside air to the fan, but in a hover, adequate cooling is much more difficult. The cooling fan pulls air from the area above and around it and pushes it through the radiator. During construction of your aircraft, or if you ever encounter cooling problems, look carefully at the areas from which air is being drawn. The exhaust system radiates the majority of the heat, so fabricate the heat shielding to fit as close as possible around the exhaust pipes and out to the body panels. The inline thermostat for engine coolant is essential to the entire cooling system. The tube that branches off of the thermostat housing supplies coolant to the oil sump heat exchanger. On cold engine startups, before the thermostat opens, virtually all of the coolant circulates through the oil sump heat exchanger. Because of this, it is very important to not exceed an idle until the coolant temperature reaches 160 degrees Fahrenheit and the thermostat opens. Oil temperature must also be in the green range on the gauge. If the thermostat is closed and the engine exceeds 3,000 RPM, the pressure in the cooling system could more than double and cause considerable damage. This is the radiator as received from Rotorway. Do not remove the cardboard from the radiator until final installation. This helps protect the fins from being bent or damaged. Tape the ports shut to prevent debris from entering. Also install the 2 plugs with Teflon tape at this time as shown. This is the fiberglass shroud and ring as received from Rotorway. Place the radiator with outlets facing up on a sturdy cardboard box. The box should be smaller than the radiator and at least 10 inches high. Make 2 templates to help lay out the hole locations as shown. Label both templates top and bottom. Place the shroud upside down next to the radiator. Flip the templates into the shroud. Measure each hole centerline from the edges of the radiator and from tank to tank. Align the templates accordingly and tape them down. Drill small pilot holes about 1/8 of an inch and recheck your layout. The minimum finished holes are as follows: inlet and outlet 1 5/8 of an inch, 4 shroud mounts 17/64 of an inch, air bleed valve hole 1 1/8 of an inch. Start small and recheck your fit often for a good fit. Be sure the fiberglass clears the welds around the 3 ports. Attach the shroud to the radiator using 1/4 20 by 5/8 of an inch bolts and fender washers. Note, before fitting and installing the shroud and ring, the engine and the secondary must be in their final install positions. Install the radiator and shroud using the 1/4 20 by 3/4 inch bolts. Use a 1/4 inch aluminum spacer between the airframe bracket and radiator. Temporarily support the rear of the radiator by wiring it to the airframe. Raise the radiator until the top of the shroud is parallel with the fan. The fan should be able to slide up the secondary shaft as the radiator is raised. Fabricate the rear radiator mounts from the 3/4 inch by 63,000 steel strap. They must be twisted approximately 90 degrees. It is now time to locate the holes for the forward bolts that secure the tail boom brackets. Use the location of the straps on the radiator to determine the best location and drill the holes in the airframe tube. Install the straps and bolts. The fan must contact the shroud evenly. Select one blade that contacts the shroud and use it as a guide to scribe 360 degrees for the fan opening. Sand off any excess resin on the inside diameter of the fan shroud ring. Remove the radiator from the airframe and put it on the box. Tape the ring onto the shroud with the flat side down and concentric to the scribe circle. Scribe the inside diameter of the ring onto the top of the shroud. then cut just outside of the scribed circle. Adequate fan clearance within the shroud now will permit the ring to be relocated later if adjustment of the secondary drive unit is necessary. Reinstall the radiator in shroud. Clamp the ring so that it is concentric with the fan. Drill two 1/8-inch rivet holes on each side, being sure to intersect the shroud. Insert a cleco in each hole. Remove the radiator and shroud and finish drill 8 rivet holes through the ring and shroud. Remove the ring. Sand the area where the sealant will be applied. Squeeze a narrow bead of silicone sealant where the parts will be joined, intersecting the rivet holes. Pop rivet the shroud and ring together. Note: in 1/8 of an inch to 3/16 of an inch clearance between the fan and ring, as indicated on print E30-2000, must be maintained around the entire fan. Trim the fan if necessary to provide this clearance. When the radiator, shroud, and ring are completed and the fit is satisfactory, finally install the tail rotor drive pulley. Then install the upper snap ring, fan pulley bearing using Loctite, and the bottom snap ring. Don't forget the fan drive belt. Remove the shroud from the radiator and install the foam strip to make a gasket between the radiator and the shroud as shown. Remove the cardboard from the radiator and reinstall the shroud. Now final install the radiator, shroud, and ring. These are the cooling system components as received from Rotorway: the surge tank, water inlet manifold, and the thermostat housing. Note, several hoses are cut from the same hose material supplied from Rotorway. Refer to construction print E30-2000 and E37-2000 for the correct hose and connections. Rotorway has supplied an ample amount of hose length to install all of the hoses. However, before cutting hoses, make sure to study the construction print and check the fit and the routes before cutting to length. Install the surge tank. Route the overflow, the 3/8 of an inch hose, E34-1151, so that it drains behind the radiator. The lower hose connector of the surge tank will be connecting to the water inlet manifold when installed later. Trim and install the one 3/8 inch hose, E34-1300, from the water pump to the manifold U-bend inlet. It is the manifold with the smallest radius as shown here. This hose must be installed as far away as possible from the exhaust pipe without kinking. After this hose has been installed to the proper fit, a fire sleeve must be installed as shown. Install the inlet manifold using hose E34-1340 made from E34-1320 just below the water pump as shown. Install hose E34-1310 between the inlet manifold and the radiator connection as shown. This hose must also be routed as far away as possible from the exhaust system. After this hose has been installed to the proper fit, a fire sleeve must be installed as shown. Route the hose E34-1370, made from E34-1350, from the left side of the inlet manifold up to the surge tank. This hose inlet shown here is for coolant returning from the oil sump heat exchanger. Assemble the thermostat and housing where the thermostat is shown. Use silicone sealant on the flanges for a gasket. This U-bend manifold is the outlet. It has the larger radius and it routes coolant from the water jackets to the thermostat. Install the thermostat assembly as shown using hose E34-1320 and hose E34-1330 made from hose E34-1320. The small hose outlet on the thermostat housing feeds coolant to the oil sump heat exchanger. Make sure the coolant hoses from the cylinder head to the water jacket avoid contact with the engine mount as shown here. Both of these hoses should have fire sleeves installed. This is the sump mounting strap, part number E28-7180, clamped into position. It will attach to the lower engine mount bolt on the pilot side and to the short square tube extending from the fuel system mount tube on the passenger side. Clean the sump with solvent and compressed air. Fabricate the sump mounting straps as shown. Glue rubber strips to the strap where it will contact the sump. Drill the 3 1/4-inch holes for the bolts that attach the strap to the sump. Do not drill the 2 3/16 of an inch bolt holes or the 5/16 of an inch bolt hole at this time. Bolt the strap to the sump and clamp the assembly into position on the airframe. When installed, the sump must be level from side to side and tilted so that the front is 1/2 inch higher than the back. With the tub installed to the seat back, verify the sump does not come in contact with the fiberglass tub. Locate and drill the 5/16 of an inch bolt hole that secures the strap to the pilot side engine mount bolt and install the strap. Adjust the sump to the correct position, clamp the strap into place, drill the 3/16 of an inch holes and install the bolts. Install hose E34-1350. It routes from the thermostat housing to the hose inlet on the sump here as shown. Secure it with wire ties outside of the tail boom support braces, away from the exhaust pipes as shown. The large 1-inch diameter hose that bends 90 degrees, located on E28 card 1F, is the main oil drain hose. It connects from the engine to the oil sump tank. Install the hoses E28-1192. These are the rocker box drains from the engine to the sump. Install the oil filter mount assembly to the airframe using two 5/16 inch bolts E00-2505 located on E28-card 1F. Install the steel braided oil hose E28-6112, which is 16 1/4 inches long, from the engine oil pump to the sump as shown. Note, make sure that you have followed the cleaning instructions earlier in this section before installing the hoses. Install the oil hose E28-6142, which is 24 inches long, from the engine to oil filter mount inlet as shown. Install the oil hose E28-6122, which is 20 5/8 inches long, from the engine to the oil filter mount outlet as shown. Remember, the steel braided hoses cannot come in contact or rub against anything else. However, if a hose touches something else, use a piece of hose and secure with wire ties. Note, the fittings on these hoses are aluminum and can be damaged if over-tightened. When the hoses are installed and the routing and fit is satisfactory, it will be necessary to prime the engine oil pump before tightening the hose fittings. Use a good grade of oil specified in the engine manual as per your ambient air temperatures. Fill the oil pump inlet and outlet fittings with oil. These fittings will have to be refilled repeatedly until all of the trapped air has been bled out and they remain completely full. It may be necessary to rotate the engine to align one of the pump openings to allow more oil in. Protect the heat wrap from oil spills during this priming process with a shop rag. Before screwing on the oil filter, coat the rubber gasket with a light film of oil. Fill the oil filter with oil. It holds approximately 1/2 quart. Add the oil slowly, allowing it to soak in. Screw the filter onto the mount by hand. Tighten it firmly by hand only. Approximately 2/3 of a turn after initial contact is correct. Do not use a filter wrench to tighten the filter to the mount, as this will make it next to impossible to remove for replacement. Wrap a piece of tape around the opening for the oil pressure fitting to prevent debris from entering until the connector is installed. Install the hoses on the oil pump fittings and fill this hose, the oil filter outlet hose, with oil and tighten the fitting. Pour the remaining 1/2 quart of oil into the oil sump. The total system oil capacity is 5 U.S. quarts. Scribe the 2 lines on the dipstick which is attached to the breather cap. These lines should represent levels below the top of the filler neck of 8 3/4 of an inch and 9 1/4 of an inch. Lubricate the inside of the filler neck with oil to prevent the cap from galling the aluminum filler neck tube. The oil level must be maintained between these lines at all times. You will be instructed to top off the oil level after starting and stopping the engine the first time. Note, if the oil level in the sump is too low, ineffective oil cooling will result. If the oil level is too high, oil will blow out of the filler pipe. Install hose E34-1360 made from E34-1350. It routes from this hose outlet on the passenger side of the sump to the right side of the inlet manifold as shown here. Secure this hose with wire ties away from the exhaust pipes as shown. Mix 1 quart of oil and 1 can of STP oil treatment, approximately 15 fluid ounces, in a container. Pour the contents into the oil bath through the inspection window opening. Apply a bead of silicone sealant around the edge of the opening and install the plexiglass inspection window. Propylene glycol is the recommended choice for the coolant antifreeze. Rotorway has tested a product called Complete, which contains the proper concentrations of propylene glycol and a corrosive inhibitor additive. The best type is their premixed version, which already has the proper amount of distilled water added. This product is distributed by Fleetguard Incorporated, a Cummins diesel company. Never use water only in the cooling system, and never mix tap or well water with the antifreeze concentrate. Procedures for adding coolant to the cooling system is found in the engine manual and will be shown later in the engine first startup procedures. Install a 4 by 4 inch piece of foam rubber to form a collar around the filler neck at the base of the filler cap. This will help prevent the oil vapors from escaping into the engine compartment. Clean the foam rubber periodically. This section will instruct the builder to cut out and fit the heat shielding, trim and fit the shroud and lower body panels, and install the muffler. Locate the following components. Reference the construction print E25-2000 muffler, E30-2000 fan shroud. Before fitting the heat shielding, it may be helpful to cut out sample pieces from light cardboard using the templates provided. Remember, the templates are to be used as a guide. Do not cut out the 25 thousandths aluminum material until you have verified the fit with the cardboard pieces. These will also give you a better understanding of how the pieces fit together and will enable you to check for accuracy. All of the shielding should fit tightly and have minimum of air gaps between the fuselage, radiator, and exhaust pipes. However, leave 1/8 of an inch to 3/16 of an inch around the exhaust pipes to allow for movement during operation. Cut out of cardboard the top 2 pieces of the exhaust heat shield using the templates. Position the cardboard pieces above the exhaust pipes as shown. The bent edges must be flush with the fan shroud as shown. Now mark the openings for the exhaust pipes. Note, you may make the openings in the top pieces the same diameter as the pipes and use the side pieces to overlap and close up the openings. This will prevent tearing and cutting the exhaust pipe wrap as you remove and reinstall the heat shield. When the fit is satisfactory, use the cardboard pieces as reference and cut out the 25 thousandths aluminum material. Use clecos to hold the pieces together and to the shroud. On final install, the heat shield will be held in position using screws and nut plates. When installing the upper front shield, verify the location of these notches on the radiator before cutting. Install the lower front shield. The bottom edge must be flush with an imaginary line extended from the fiberglass tub. Note, before trimming, the rear of the heat shield must be installed to the shroud, and the front must be attached to the tail boom support tubes with the aluminum straps and 1-inch cushion loop clamps as shown. Viewing from the front of the ship, mark a line along the front heat shield following the contour of the tub and then trim the shield. This shows the front heat shield trimmed to match the contour of the tub. Install the radiator rear shield. The bottom edge of the heat shielding and fan shroud should fit within 1/8 of an inch of the body panels when trimmed properly. The aluminum heat shield and the fiberglass shroud are long on the bottom and must be trimmed to match the contour of the lower rear fuselage cowlings. To achieve a proper fit, install the cowlings. Mark the points of contact along the shielding and shroud. After initial rough cut, trim a little at a time, gradually adjusting the rear of the panel closer to the tailbone. The upper and lower cowling panels must have the rubber stripping in place to achieve the proper fit around the tailbone. Use clecos to hold in position. Tape the areas that require the most trim work to match the lower panels. This shows the trimmed and fitted heat shield and shroud. Reference construction print E25-2000 to make and install the heat shields that fit between the top of the exhaust pipes and the fuel tanks. The installation of these heat shields are important for a number of reasons. One reason is to help insulate the exhaust heat away from the fuel tanks. It will also deflect fuel that might be spilled during refueling and contacting the hot exhaust pipes. If the exhaust pipe were to develop a pinhole leak in this area, the heat shield would prevent the leak and the concentrated heat coming from it from contacting the fuel tank. The heat shield material on the pilot's side is secured with a fabricated bracket made from 63,000 steel strap as shown here, and fabricate a bracket to secure the shield in this position to the bolt on the fan drive countershaft bearing. The heat shield should just clear the exhaust elbow and not contact the wrap. On the passenger side, fabricate the brackets as shown. In viewing from above, make sure these heat shields do not extend past the 1-inch airframe tube on both sides of the drive system. Fabricate the muffler straps as shown on print E25-2000. Use safety wire to position the muffler. Use the rubber straps between the upper and lower steel straps as shown. Bolt the upper straps to the back of the radiator. On final install, drill a small hole through the steel bracket for the safety wire. Then safety wire the bolt head to the strap as shown. Note, do not drill on assembly. Remove brackets, drill the safety wire hole, and reinstall the muffler. This will prevent the drill bit from striking the radiator accidentally. Install the bolts, springs, and nuts in the exhaust swivel. Secure the nuts with cotter pins. Trim the lower body panels for clearance around the muffler straps. This section will instruct the builder to install the fuel tanks, finger screens, retention straps for the fuel tanks, fuel sender, fuel pumps, shutoff valve and filter, fuel pressure regulator, and route and install the fuel hoses. Locate the following components. Reference the construction print E25-2000 fuel tanks, E25-2001 fuel system, and E37-2000 fuel tank strainer. Use Teflon tape on all fittings with pipe threads in PT in this assembly. Pipe threads are tapered so that they seal across the threads. Do not use Teflon tape on the other fittings, such as the AN aluminum hose ends. These type of fittings have a machine chamfer which creates a positive seal. Unlike pipe threads, these will not seal better by being tightened more and can be damaged by over-tightening. The exec 162f is equipped with Rotorway's unique FADEC electronic engine control system and fuel injection. In this system, gasoline is delivered to the injectors at a very high pressure, 54 psi. By comparison, the fuel system on the earlier RI 162 engines with carburetors was about 4 psi. Because of this, only the best quality hoses and fittings are used. When installing the fuel system components, be aware of the following. Before installing the fuel hoses, flush them thoroughly with solvent and blow them dry with compressed air. Carefully inspect the insides of the hoses for any dirt or debris. Apply light film of engine oil to the threads and chamfers of the fittings. The braided steel hoses should be routed so that they curve smoothly without being kinked or sharply bent. The steel braiding on the hoses is extremely abrasive. Once the engine is running, vibrations will cause the braid to wear through whatever it comes in contact with, just like a file. Because of this, the hoses must be positioned so they do not contact or rub on anything else. If a braided steel hose must touch another component, cut a length of rubber hose, wrap it around the braided hose, and secure it with wire ties. The aluminum hose ends and fittings can be damaged if over-tightened. To get the correct amount of leverage, grip the wrench about 3 or 4 inches from the fitting. Do not turn on the fuel pumps or add fuel to the system until the helicopter is ready for the first startup. Before adding any fuel to the system, double-check the tightness and security of all fittings. When fuel is pumped through the hoses for the first time, wear eye protection and have a fire extinguisher nearby. The pressure of this system can cause fuel to be sprayed surprisingly far and fast. The 2 fuel tanks drain simultaneously so that the lateral center of gravity of the helicopter is not affected. The tanks are made from a cross-linked polyethylene plastic material noted for its durability. A similar fuel tank made from aluminum would be 10 to 15% lighter. However, there would be no comparison in strength. Be sure to check for leakage, especially around the fittings, upon final installation of the tanks. Important, before operation, be sure that the heat shielding material has been taped to the fuel tanks and that the shields on the exhaust manifolds have been properly installed. Extended hovering maneuvers, such as those which will be performed during your initial learning to hover stage, should be done with the lower fuselage cowlings removed to ensure continuous ambient fuel temperature. This will also allow easy access to fuel, oil, and cooling systems to inspect for leaks during the first few hours of operation. These are the fuel tanks and fuel gauge sender as received from Rotorway. Use an air grinder or a drill to make holes in the fuel tanks where the caps and fuel gauge sender will go. The material is approximately 3/16 of an inch thick in these locations. Be careful not to gouge the fuel tank wall directly below the filler cap holes. Check the other threaded hole openings for debris. Use the fuel gauge sender quart gasket as a template to locate the opening for the sender probe and the bolt holes. Note, the mounting holes are not symmetrical, so make sure you position the sender so the adjustment screws are outboard as shown. Drill the bolt holes small enough so that the bolts make their own threads in the tank. Use a piece of scrap material to verify drill bit size. Install each bolt to verify the sending unit's mounting holes. Finish trimming out the excess material with a knife, grinder, or file. Flush both tanks thoroughly with water to remove the plastic chips and debris. Be sure the tanks are completely dry before connecting any hoses. Make the two finger screens or fuel tank strainers as shown on print E37-2000 and solder them in the fittings. Be sure to keep the solder clear of the pipe threads. Excess solder in the pipe threads could damage the pipe threads in the tank or make it virtually impossible to start the fitting in the tank. The finger screens keep chips and debris out of the hoses and also prevent the openings from being covered over by a large object. Wrap the threads of the reducers, part number E25-42000, with Teflon tape and install them in the fuel tanks. Do not allow the bushings to bottom out against the plastic. Note, it may be difficult to start the fittings into the holes. Make sure that they thread straight before tightening with a wrench. Referring to construction print E25-2001 fuel system, locate the fittings for the pilot and passenger tanks. Wrap the pipe threads with Teflon tape and install the fittings. Install the crossover fittings in both tanks near the filler cap holes. Install a fuel return fitting in the passenger side tank. Use Teflon tape on the pipe threads. Install the fuel gauge sender using the instructions provided with the kit. Align the holes and apply a sealer such as Permatex on the gasket. Place the sending unit in the tank. Rotate until the holes line up, then tighten down on the mounting screws. Use tape to cover the openings and the end of fittings to prevent contamination to the fuel tanks during the mounting procedures. Before mounting the fuel tanks, locate the 8 spark plugs and set the gap as per the engine manual specifications. Coat the threads with a light film of anti-seize prior to installation. Remove the plastic plugs from the spark plug holes. Install the 8 spark plugs and torque the plugs to 10 foot-pounds. Glue rubber strips on the fuel tank brackets and airframe. Leave a gap in the rubber for the shoulder harnesses in the drive tube area. Note, it may be necessary to grind away clearance for the lower fitting and hose so that it will not rub against the bracket as shown. Install the heat shielding on the tanks as shown here. Use the aluminum tape to hold in place. The tanks can be held in position with duct tape and safety wire until they are ready to be permanently mounted. Allow 1/2 of an inch clearance between the seat back panel and the fuel tank. Position the top edge of the fuel tank filler nipple 1/2 of an inch to 5/8 of an inch below the fiberglass cowling. Position the rear of the fuel tank 1/8 of an inch above the top of the airframe tube as shown. Fabricate the rear retention straps that hold the fuel tanks from the 63 thousandths by 3/4 inch material. Reference construction print E25-2000. Glue the rubber strips to the retention straps with weather strip adhesive. Make the clamp that holds the eye bolt for the forward strap. Glue a rubber strip to the inside and mount into position on the airframe as shown just above the tank. With the tank held in proper position, fabricate the forward straps as shown. Remember to allow for the rubber strips. Note the clearance of the fuel tank and body. The fuel tank should not rub on the body at any point. With the tanks mounted into position with the straps, check if there is a place where a nut plate may come in contact with the fuel tank. If there is, shield that particular area by gluing a small piece of rubber stripping to the fuel tank. Be sure the rear bottom of the fuel tank does not rub on the fan drive on the pilot's side. Be sure the rear bottom of the fuel tank does not rub on the water pump or alternator on the passenger side. Cut and fit the vent hose between the tanks. Make this hose from E25-1392 3/8-inch hose material and install the clamps. The fuel hoses should be tightened by hand only until all components of the fuel system have been installed. Then, when the hose routing is satisfactory, tighten the fittings with a wrench. Remember to grip the wrench close to the fittings to help prevent over-tightening. When installing the fuel hoses, the hose ends can be turned if necessary for better alignment. Hold the fitting with a wrench as shown, and turn the end by hand. When installing the clamps that hold the fuel pumps, make a slight bend in the clamp to help install in the mount tube bracket as shown. Install the fuel pumps. Mount them with the negative, black, electrical terminals facing each other and the positive, yellow, terminals away from each other. Make sure the ribs on the pumps are above the hose clamps as shown. Note, keep the openings plugged until the hoses are installed to help keep dirt out. Mount the fuel shutoff valve filter assembly using the socket head cap screws, aluminum spacers, and hose clamp. The cable will be installed later. Reference section 22. Remove tape from the tank fittings and clean off any adhesive with acetone. Install the swivel T E25-4320 on the right side of the shutoff valve assembly. The Econ clamps located on E25 card 1F are covers that fit over the bare ends of the braided hose assemblies, E25-4040 and E25-4050, which connect to the bottom or inlets of the fuel pumps. To install, remove the protective tape from the end of the hose. Any frayed wires from the braiding can be trimmed with scissors or wire cutters if necessary. Caution, handle carefully. The steel braid wires are sharp. Tighten a number 4 hose clamp and fit it in the econ clamp. Then open the hose clamp inside the econ clamp. Fit them both in the hoses. Apply a light film of engine oil to the inside of the hose and the inlet on the pump for easier installation. Install the hose assemblies as shown. Make sure the hose is pushed all the way up to the pump before tightening the clamp. Adjust them so that the swivel T is accessible with a wrench. This will make it easier to remove the screen filter for maintenance later. Using template E25-1, make the fuel drain cock mounting bracket. Screw the fittings and drain cock into the T using Teflon tape on the threads. Mount the assembled drain cock on the bracket with nut plates and cushion loop clamps as shown. Route the hose E25-4010 from the pilot side fuel tank to the drain through the hole in the rear landing gear bracket. Cover the braided steel hose with a piece of rubber hose and secure it with wire ties to prevent chafing. If your airframe does not have a hole in this bracket, as in this installation, you may route the hose as shown. Route the hose assembly E254030 from the crossover T to the drain as shown. You will be instructed later to secure the bracket to the tub in this location with screws and nut plates. Screw the fittings into the fuel filter. Use the crush washers provided. Do not damage the crush washers by over-tightening the fittings. Cut the rubber to fit on the filter mounting bracket and glue it in place with weather strip adhesive. Install the filter as shown, with a step to the pilot side of the bracket. Secure the filter with the two hose clamps. Install the two E25-4270 adapters to the fuel pumps, and then install the hoses E25-4060 pump to filter pilot side and E25-4070 pump to filter passenger side. Route the hose assembly E25-4080 from the filter to the fuel rail on the engine pilot side.